Okay, this is a video response to Theo Warner. Quite a lot to pack in, quite a lot I want to say here, so I hope I don't forget to say it. I made a couple of notes, but not very much. Here, this is a video response to Theo Warner, then who's made a video response to Bionic Dance. The video response is Bionic Dance Moronic Stance. It's kind of, he likes those kind of alliterative titles, doesn't he, Theo, if you're familiar with his videos. What we're talking about here is the subject of defining the term atheism, and there's quite a bit I want to say on this to kind of give my perspective on this and make a few comments on a few things that Theo says in his video. The first thing that I want to say is that Theo makes a point later on in his video that he kind of brings in some examples of different people and says, well, how does that fit in with this definition? How does this fit in with this definition? I think that's just I don't think that's a problem with this particular definition of atheism, because I think whatever definition you could come up with, you're going to have this same kind of a problem. That's just generally a problem of applying labels to people, is that it generalizes and we end up pigeonholing people into categories that don't necessarily apply to them, or apply to them but only to a degree. And so I think we're always better, it's a good first approximation, but we're always better to find out what people's views really are than just to try and work on some label that's been applied to them either by themselves or by other people. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say. I then wanted to agree, the next thing I want to do is to agree with Theo with regard to the way that words are defined and why we bother defining words in the first place. And what I agree with Theo is that really one of the things that's important when we're talking about defining words is what we're trying to achieve, what the purpose of that word is, what the use of that word is, and does the definition that we have help us in any kind of way. And clearly some ways of defining words make them more helpful than others, and some ways in which words are defined are very unhelpful. The word theist is a very unhelpful word because it has two definitions. There's one global definition of people that believe in gods that include deists and things such as that, and then there's also that very specific category of theist that doesn't include deists. So that's a confusing word in the way that that's defined. But that brings us to the other aspect of definition, which is that we don't actually choose how words are defined. It seems to me that part of the problem with conversations such as this with definitions is that we start speaking in different ways. We start confusing descriptive ways of looking at words, and there's probably two descriptive ways of looking at words. There's the historical descriptive way of looking at words, of how they were originally defined, where they came from, what the roots of that word were, how they used to be used. Then there's that kind of contemporary descriptive way of looking at words, and then there's, I suppose you could say, a kind of normative way of looking at words, and how best could we define them, maybe how could we alter the definitions from where they are now if we were able to do so. I think that's part of the problem that's took place in this conversation here. One of the specific disagreements I've always had with Kate, with her definition of lack of a belief in God, is how she arrives at that. She looks at the word atheism and says theism, not theism. And maybe from it, I don't know exactly how the word atheism came about, so I'm not going to comment on the historical perspective. I'm not really that interested on that, but maybe from an historical perspective you can see how that could be the case. Certainly from the roots of the word, this is a Greek word, I think atheos or something like that, and from the roots of that you could see that that would make sense. But that really isn't how words are defined. I mean, we know that Kate herself defines herself as a lesbian, but we don't insist on that, we don't mandate from that she regards herself as an inhabitant of the island of Lesbos. We accept that the definitions of words can change over time through usage as much as anything else. And it doesn't have to be a sweeping wholesale change in the way that the word lesbian has changed. It can be a much more subtle change. And it's no point just demanding that we have to insist on whatever the original definition of that word is. That just isn't how it works. So I think immediately we're encountering problems here, because we've got some people who are talking about how the word is defined out there in the real world, in the here and now. Some people talking about how the word ought to be defined with regard to some kind of historical perspective or the roots of the word, and some people talking about how the word ought to be defined to make the word more useful. So I think that's a problem, and we need to be aware of what we're actually talking about. Let's talk about the definition, though, that Kate uses. And although I don't like the way she arrives at the definition, I don't have as many problems with that as a definition as you do, Theo. What she talks about then is a lack of a belief in God. That's the kind of definition she trumps up. And one thing that you say is a problem with this is that, as some people have said, well, a tree lacks a belief in God. So that kind of makes it all sound a bit silly, doesn't it, as if we're putting people in the same category of trees. But then I do lack a belief in God. So that does put me in the same category as a tree anyway, doesn't it? So is there a problem with that? Does that mean that I shouldn't profess a lack of belief in anything, because to profess a lack of belief in something puts me in the same category as a tree or a rock? I don't think that's a problem. So if that isn't a problem to discuss it in that way, I don't see why defining a word in that way is a problem. But we do need to differentiate between different types of lack of belief, because clearly there are some qualitative differences between the lack of belief that I have in God, which is based on having the cognitive faculties to assess the concept and having assessed the arguments for and against the concept, and a rock that doesn't have the cognitive faculties to assess the concept and, of course, therefore hasn't assessed the concept, and maybe some positions that lie in between. I always like, in these situations like that, Theo, what I always like to do is to suck God out of the equation here, and to consider something that isn't God, and to look at how we would define a lack of belief in something else. So I could give you the example of something like goblins and whether we lack a belief. Well, actually, probably goblin isn't a very good example, because we've all considered goblins, haven't we? We've all considered, we understand the concept of a goblin, and we've considered a goblin, and so that wouldn't fit with all examples. So let's come up with something. Let's come up with a goblin slug. I don't, there's probably something deeply psychological. I don't know where that quite came from, but let's consider a goblin slug, which is it's a creature that's got the body. No, it's got the body of a goblin, but it's got the head of a slug. Okay, that's what a goblin slug is. So consider this concept of a goblin slug. I would suggest, and it's a good concept, this, because I hope I'm right on this, that nobody who watches this video has ever thought of the idea of a goblin slug, a creature with the body of a goblin and the head of a slug. And so nobody's considered this. So I can now ask you whether you believe in goblin slugs. I would hope, really, I would hope that everybody would say they didn't. But did you believe in goblin slugs before I mentioned the concept? Well, I would think that most people would say, well, no, I didn't believe in goblin slugs before you mentioned the concept either. But clearly there is a big difference between the lack of belief you have in the concept now and the lack of belief you had in the concept then. I mean, the lack of belief you have in a concept now is going to be based on things that you know about the world. You know that goblins don't exist, or we suspect that goblins don't exist, and slugs, we do know slugs exist, obviously, but slugs, I mean, the slug part is going to have to be in proportion to the goblin. So how's that going to work? They don't have a skeletal structure, slug, so all the slug is going to kind of flop about, isn't it? The slug head isn't going to support its own weight. And how's the DNA, this kind of chimeric animal, how's the DNA going to work in that kind of thing? So there's lots of reasons now why we wouldn't believe in it, but we didn't believe in it before. But our lack of belief before was of a very different nature. And does a rock believe in a goblin slug? No, I would suggest a rock doesn't. And does a baby believe in a goblin slug? No, I would suggest it doesn't. And does a young child believe in a goblin slug? I would suggest not either. So, but here's the difference. This is where I see the difference, and this is where I quite like the lack of a belief in God. I think that's a reasonable starting point. But I think the idea that the kind of that the differentiator is between us and babies on one side and rocks on the other is wrong, probably. I think the point where the difference, the qualitative difference between different types of belief lies elsewhere. And I think there are 2 points. I've given you one of them already, and that's when you've considered the concept. Once you've considered the concept, your lack of belief changes there. but you still had a lack of belief before then. But I think there's another important point, and that's the point at which you have the cognitive faculties, the capabilities to understand the concept if the concept was presented to you. And I don't think, tell me if I'm wrong, and I'm not really interested in this kind of developmental biology in a sense that I don't need people to tell me, well, at this age is probably the age where it is. If you want to do that, then do that in the comments, but I'm not that interested in that. The point is that there will come a point whereupon in your development, you're a baby, you've been born, everything's going great, and you start to, the sophistication of your mental faculties increases, and there will become a point whereby the concept of a god or a goblin slug would be within your realm of comprehension if it was presented to you. And I think that is the key point. That is the key moment, and it probably isn't a moment, it's probably a blur that stretches over a few weeks, but that is the key blur whereby the concept of belief changes from that which is really just like that of a rock and is trivial to where it actually starts to mean something. And I think it does mean something if people lack a belief there, even if they haven't been externally presented with a concept. Because unlike, I don't know whether this is what Kate thinks, it's what you say she thinks, that she believes in the idea of a blank slate, tabula rasa, that kind of thing. I certainly don't believe in that, and I'm sure that there are plenty of concepts that are intuitive, that are innate within our brains. I think phobia of things like snakes and spiders may well be intuitive in many people's brains. I have a pet cat, Theo, and something which was quite interesting a few years ago, I had a board game, and this board game was a game of Dracula, and if you ended up going round and landing on one of these, you had to move these little, what were they, little vampire bats around, or maybe they were gargoyles, and if you landed on them, you had to have this mask on, and this mask really looked like a kind of a bat shape with these big ears and big teeth. And I held that up to my face in front of the cat, and the cat shat itself, fur on end, hissed, ran off. And so I did an experiment along with my father at that point, and we actually just cut the cutout of that shape and held that up as a black cutout of that shape, and that was enough to trigger that response in the cat. Now, our cat has never seen anything of that dimension before. I think that's innate. That response in the cat was innate to that shape. Perhaps we have an innate, intuitive appreciation of God at the point where it kicks in, at the point where our cognitive faculties are able to understand such a concept. That's a possibility, that's a hypothesis. I don't think it's true. But that's why I think this is an important point, because do you have that or don't you have that? There's something significant, there's a significant question you can ask there that you couldn't ask to a baby, that you couldn't ask to a rock. What I do think we have is that we have an intuitive idea of the supernatural. We apply supernatural, or we see supernatural agency even where it isn't involved. I do think that's the case, and we know that that's often erroneous, and we know that we do that when we're young, and we see people in primitive societies that aren't as learned as us, you know, tribes in South American places like that, do the same kind of thing, to apply agency to all kinds of things, so that we know that we do that and we misapply that. But that's very different to the idea of an intuitive concept of God, especially, and I think a lot of the reason that people make this point of wanting to point out that babies are atheists is because you get people who are making this spurious argument that as if babies are born monotheists. And I think one of the interesting thing is that maybe we do have an intuitive sort of leaning towards applying supernatural agency, but I think monotheism is certainly not where that goes. Monotheism is probably in the same boat as naturalism in that respect, in that neither of those are sort of innate positions that we grow up with. We don't grow up as naturalists, we grow up as supernaturalists, but not monotheists, nothing like monotheists. We see agency all over the place from a multitude of sources. So I quite like Kate's definition, is basically what I'm trying to say, but it is unsophisticated in a way. It's not a good way of describing people. You're much better to know what actually people believe. I do think there are qualitatively different types of lack of belief. And I would have no problem, Theo, with saying, defining atheism as a lack of belief in God for all agents that have the cognitive faculties to consider the concept. That wouldn't be a bad starting point if you wanted to make it a little bit more sophisticated and you want to push rocks out of the category and perhaps push babies and some toddlers or whatever out of the category as well. That's pretty much all I want to say on that. I've probably waffled on for long enough. What I do want to say to my subscribers is, if you're not subscribed to Theo Warner, subscribe to Theo Warner. He's got an incredible intellect within his cranium and an incredible head of hair outside of it. I don't know which one of those two I'm most jealous of. Probably the older I get and the more my hair recedes, the more the balance tips towards the hair rather than the intellect. But he's certainly a YouTuber that's very well worth subscribing to. That's probably, I can't stop thinking about these goblin slugs now, and what I would say, because while I've been making this video, it's been ticking round in my head, is that if you encounter a goblin slug, I would anticipate they've got the head of a slug so you can easily outwit them, and you're probably not in any danger. They're going to be vegetarians, unless you're walking back from the shops perhaps clutching a large number of lettuces or salad vegetables of one description or another. It might be worth, if you are worried about them, just as much for your peace of mind of anything, to take a small container of salt with you, just in case that eventuality you should be challenged by a hungry and voracious goblin slug. That's probably, I don't know what I'm even going on about now. Anyway, thank you for watching this video. If you have any comments on this, and I'm sure some people will have some comments on this because they always do, which I don't mind. Thanks for watching the video, and bye for now.